The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass when Ayanna first saw the dust cloud on the horizon. She was gathering wild berries near the stream that bordered her village, her woven basket already half full of the sweet purple fruit that her grandmother loved so much. At 17, she had learned to read the signs of the land well. But this morning something felt different. The dust cloud moved too fast, too purposefully toward their peaceful settlement. She dropped her basket and ran back toward the village, her long black hair streaming behind her like a banner. The elderly women were already pointing toward the approaching riders, their weathered faces creased with worry. Ayanna's mother, Wakanda, emerged from their teepee with baby clothes still in her hands from the washing she had been doing by the river. The riders came like thunder across the plains. Ayanna counted at least 20 men on horseback, their faces painted for war, but these were not the familiar markings of neighboring tribes. These men wore the clothes of traders mixed with traditional warrior dress. Their leader, a tall man with scars across his cheek, raised his hand and the group slowed as they entered the village. Chief Standing Bear stepped forward, his arms spread wide in the universal gesture of peace. He spoke in the common tongue that many tribes shared for trading. The scarred leader dismounted and walked toward him, but his hand never left the weapon at his side. The conversation was brief and tense. Ayanna could see her chief's shoulders sag as the stranger spoke. What happened next would haunt her dreams forever. The riders had not come to trade or negotiate. They had come to take. The scarred man gave a sharp whistle, and his warriors spread throughout the village like wolves among sheep. Children screamed and ran toward their mothers. The elderly tried to shield the young ones with their own bodies. Ayanna watched in horror as families were separated. Strong young men were bound with rope and forced to their knees. Women of childbearing age were pulled from their homes, their children reaching out with desperate hands. Her own mother was seized by two men while trying to protect Ayanna's younger brother. She tried to run toward her family, but rough hands grabbed her arms from behind. A rope was quickly tied around her wrists, the coarse fibers cutting into her skin as she struggled. The man who held her spoke in broken words of her language, telling her to stop fighting or her family would suffer more. The raiders worked with practiced efficiency. This was not their first time stealing people from their homes. They took only the strongest and youngest, leaving behind the elderly and small children who would slow them down. Ayanna's grandmother reached toward her with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face as she whispered blessings and prayers for protection. As they were forced onto horses behind their captors, Ayanna looked back at her village one last time. Smoke was beginning to rise from some of the teepees. Her little brother stood beside their grandmother, his small hand waving frantically. She wanted to call out to him to tell him she would return, but her captor's hand covered her mouth. The journey began immediately. The raiders moved fast across the prairie, changing direction several times to confuse anyone who might try to follow. Ayanna was tied to the saddle horn of the scarred leader's horse, her hands growing numb from the tight ropes. Around her, she could hear the quiet sobs of other captives, including her mother who rode several horses behind. They traveled through the heat of the day without stopping for water or food. When the sun began to set, they finally made camp in a small canyon hidden from view. The captives were tied to trees, given small amounts of water and dried meat. Ayanna's mother was close enough that they could whisper to each other in the darkness. Her mother's voice was steady despite their terrible situation. She reminded Ayanna of the old stories, of ancestors who had survived great hardships and found their way home. She spoke of the spirits that watched over their people, and how even in the darkest times hope could be found. That first night, Ayanna learned they were not the only captives. The raiders had attacked other villages over the past months, gathering people like her to sell at distant trading posts. An older woman from another tribe whispered that they were being taken far from their homeland, to places where their families would never find them. The scarred leader approached their group as the fire burned low. He studied each captive carefully, making marks on a piece of bark with charcoal. When he reached Ayanna, he grabbed her chin and turned her face toward the firelight. His eyes were cold as winter ice as he examined her like she was a horse he might purchase. He spoke to one of his men in a language she did not recognize. The other man nodded and made more marks on the bark. Ayanna realized with growing horror that they were cataloging their captives, recording their age and strength and health like goods to be sold at market. Sleep came in short, fitful periods that night. Every sound made her jump, afraid that wolves or worse predators had found their camp. But the greatest predators were the men who guarded them, who treated them not as people but as valuable cargo to be delivered safely to whoever would pay the highest price. When dawn broke over the canyon, Ayanna saw her reflection in a small pool of water. Her face was already marked with dust and despair, but her eyes still held the fire her grandmother had always praised. She made a silent promise to herself and to her ancestors that she would survive whatever lay ahead. She would find a way to return home, no matter how far these raiders took her. The scarred leader kicked dirt over the fire and shouted orders to his men. The captives were untied from the trees only to be tied to the horses again. As they rode out of the canyon and back onto the open prairie, Ayanna tried to memorize every landmark, every hill and stream they passed. Somewhere in the distance, her little brother was waiting for her return. 3 weeks of hard travel brought them to a place Ayanna had never imagined could exist. The trading post sprawled along the banks of a wide river, with buildings made of logs and stone rather than the hide tipis of her people. Smoke rose from many chimneys and the sound of hammering metal rang through the air, but what shocked her most was the number of people moving about. More humans than she had ever seen gathered in one place. The scarred leader, who she had learned was called Broken Tooth by his men, led their group toward a large wooden building at the center of the settlement. Outside, other groups of captives sat in the dirt, chained together and guarded by armed men. Ayanna's heart sank as she realized the true scope of this evil trade. There were people from many different tribes, some she recognized and others whose clothes and markings were completely foreign to her. A fat man in strange cloth clothing emerged from the building. His skin was pale like fish belly, and hair grew on his face in a way that seemed unnatural to Ayanna. He walked with authority, and even Broken Tooth showed him respect. This had to be the one who would decide their fate. The pale man examined each captive with the same cold calculation that Broken Tooth had shown by the fire. He felt their arms for muscle, looked at their teeth like he was buying horses, and made notes in a book with strange markings that Ayanna would later learn was writing. When he reached her, his examination lasted longer than the others. He spoke to Broken Tooth in the pale man's language, pointing at Ayanna several times. She could not understand the words, but the tone was that of bargaining, of men discussing prices. Broken Tooth shook his head and held up more fingers than the pale man had shown. The negotiation continued for several minutes while Ayanna stood frozen, understanding that her life was being bought and sold like a beaver pelt. Finally, the pale man nodded and handed Broken Tooth a pouch that clinked with metal coins. He gestured toward Ayanna, and one of his workers stepped forward with heavy iron chains. The ropes that had bound her for weeks were cut away, only to be replaced with metal shackles that were much heavier and colder against her skin. She was led to a wooden cage built against the side of the building. Inside, several other young women sat or lay on straw that smelled of animals and human waste. The door was locked behind her with a loud clang that seemed to echo in her chest. For the first time since her capture, Ayanna broke down and wept. An older woman in the cage spoke to her in broken words from Ayanna's language. She had been captured months ago from a tribe that lived near the great waters to the east. Her name was Singing Bird, and she had become a source of comfort for the newer captives. She explained what she had learned about this terrible place. The trading post was where people were brought from all over the land to be sold to those who wanted workers. They did not have to pay. Some would be sent to work in fields far to the south, where they would plant and harvest crops under the burning sun. Others would be taken to work in the strange stone cities where the pale people lived. None would see their families again. Singing Bird had tried to escape twice. The first time she had been caught within a day and beaten until she could not walk. The second time she had made it 3 days into the wilderness before dogs tracked her down. Each failed escape had resulted in heavier chains and closer watching. But she had not given up hope entirely. She whispered to Ayanna about a young man from the Dakota people who sometimes came to the trading post. Unlike the others who worked there, his eyes held kindness when he looked at the captives. His name was Running Wolf, and Singing Bird believed he was different from the men who bought and sold human lives. Days blurred into nights in the wooden cage. Ayanna was fed thin soup and stale bread once each day. The pale man who had bought her would sometimes bring other pale people to look at his captives, showing them off like prized animals. She learned to keep her eyes down during these inspections, as any sign of defiance resulted in punishment. The other women in the cage shared their stories in whispered voices during the long nights. Each tale was similar: villages attacked by raiders, families torn apart, loved ones left behind. Some of the women had children who had been taken to different cages, and their grief was a constant presence in the small space. One morning, Ayana woke to find that 2 of the women were gone. Singing Bird explained that they had been sold during the night to traders heading south. This was how it worked. Women and men disappeared without warning as buyers came and went. Each departure left the remaining captives wondering when their turn would come. It was on a day when autumn was beginning to touch the leaves that Ayana first saw Running Wolf. He was carrying water buckets toward the cages when their eyes met through the wooden bars. Unlike every other man in the trading post, he did not look at her with calculation or cruel amusement. Instead, she saw something in his face that she had not seen since leaving her village. Simple human recognition. He was tall and lean with the strong build of a warrior, but his movements were careful and controlled. His clothes were a mixture of Dakota traditional dress and the practical clothing worn by others at the trading post. His long black hair was braided in the style of his people, and his face bore the high cheekbones and strong features that marked him as truly native to this land. Running Wolf set down the water buckets and approached her cage slowly, as if trying not to frighten a wounded animal. He spoke quietly in the Dakota language, asking if she was hurt or sick. When she answered that she was neither, relief crossed his face. He told her his name and asked for hers. The simple act of being spoken to as a person rather than property brought fresh tears to her eyes. He reached through the bars and briefly touched her hand, a gesture of comfort that meant more than all the food and water she had received since arriving at this terrible place. Running Wolf glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then whispered that he was not like the others who worked here. He had reasons for being at the trading post that he could not explain yet, but he wanted her to know that he saw her as a person, as someone's daughter and sister who deserved to be free. Before he could say more, the fat pale man's voice boomed across the yard, calling for Running Wolf to come help load a wagon. He squeezed Ayana's hand once more and whispered that he would return when he could. As he walked away, Ayana felt the first spark of hope she had experienced since her capture. Running Wolf returned 3 days later, this time bringing fresh water and clean straw for the cage. The fat pale man, who Ayana had learned was called Trader Morrison, watched him work but seemed satisfied with his diligence. What Morrison did not see was the small piece of bark that Running Wolf slipped between the wooden bars as he spread the straw. Ayana waited until darkness fell before examining the bark. Scratched into its surface were simple pictures, the kind of message that could be read without knowing the white man's writing. The pictures showed a crescent moon, then 2 full moons, then a crescent again. Below that was the image of a wolf running toward the rising sun. She understood that Running Wolf was telling her to wait, to be ready in about a month when the moon was right. The next time he came close to her cage, she managed to scratch her own message into a small stone. She drew the image of a bird in flight, the symbol her people used for agreement and understanding. When she passed it back to him through the bars, she saw relief flood his features. Over the following weeks, Running Wolf found ways to communicate more complex information. Sometimes he would leave messages hidden under the water buckets. Other times he would use hand signals that looked like casual gestures to anyone watching. Gradually, Ayana learned the details of his plan. Running Wolf was not actually a worker at the trading post by choice. He was there as a spy for his Dakota tribe, gathering information about the raiders who had been attacking villages throughout the region. His people had sent him to learn the routes and methods used by men like Broken Tooth, so they could better defend their settlements. But seeing the suffering of the captives had changed his mission. He could not simply gather information and leave while innocent people remained in chains. His plan was dangerous and would likely result in his own death if discovered, but he had decided that some things were worth the risk. The trading post was heavily guarded during the day, but at night only 2 men stayed awake to watch over everything. One guard walked the perimeter of the settlement, while the other sat by the main building where Morrison kept his money and records. Neither guard paid much attention to the slave cages, as the heavy locks and chains made escape seem impossible. Running Wolf had been secretly filing away at one of the locks on Ayana's cage during his nighttime visits. The work was slow and had to be done without making noise, but each night the metal grew a little weaker. He estimated it would take 2 more weeks to weaken it enough that it could be broken with a strong pull. He also explained the route they would take to escape. There was a small boat hidden among the reeds downstream from the trading post. The river would carry them quickly away from the settlement, and from there they could travel overland toward Dakota territory. His people would provide protection once they reached the tribal lands. But there was a problem that made Ayana's heart heavy. Running Wolf's boat could only carry 2 people safely, and there were still 4 women in her cage. He had tried to figure out how to save them all, but the mathematics of escape were cruel. Taking more people would slow them down, and almost certainly result in everyone being caught. Singing Bird overheard parts of their whispered conversations and understood what was being planned. One night, as Ayana lay awake wrestling with the terrible choice she faced, Singing Bird spoke to her in the darkness. The older woman's voice was calm and certain. She told Ayana that she must go when the opportunity came. Singing Bird had been a captive for too long and had grown weak. The other 2 women were from tribes far to the west and would not survive the journey to Dakota lands, even if they could be freed. But Ayana was young and strong, and her escape might give the others hope that freedom was still possible. Ayana wanted to argue, to find another way, but deep in her heart she knew that Singing Bird was right. This chance might never come again, and refusing it would not help the other captives. It would only mean that all of them remained enslaved. During the day, she began to prepare her body for the hard journey ahead. She did exercises in the small cage to keep her muscles strong. She ate every scrap of food given to her, even when the moldy bread made her stomach turn. She studied the guards' patterns and memorized every detail of the trading post's layout. Running Wolf continued his careful work on the lock, each night removing tiny metal filings that he scattered in the dirt so they would not be noticed. He also began leaving small supplies near the cage, items that looked like everyday tools but could be useful during an escape. A sharp piece of metal that could cut ropes, a small pouch of dried meat, a flint stone for making fire. The other captives throughout the trading post seemed to sense that something was changing, though they could not know what. There was a tension in the air, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Some of the guards became more watchful, and Morrison himself walked among the cages more frequently. One night, disaster nearly struck when a guard decided to check the locks on all the cages. Running Wolf had not had time to file the lock further, and the damage he had already done was barely visible in the darkness. The guard rattled each lock and moved on, but Ayana's heart pounded for hours afterward. Running Wolf became more cautious after that close call. He varied his routine so that his presence near the cages would not seem suspicious. Sometimes he would work on other tasks for several days before returning to continue his work on the lock. The delay was frustrating, but getting caught would doom them all. Finally, on a night when the moon was just a thin crescent in the sky, Running Wolf approached her cage with unusual urgency. He whispered that traders were coming in the morning to buy several of the female captives. Morrison had already marked which women would be sold, and Ayana was among them. Tonight was their only chance, whether the lock was completely ready or not. He showed her a piece of strong rope that he would tie around the damaged lock. When he pulled from outside the cage while she pushed from inside, the weakened metal should give way. They would have only moments to escape before the noise brought the guards running. Singing Bird pressed something into Ayana's hand in the darkness. It was a small carved bird, the kind that mothers made for their daughters as protection tokens. She whispered a blessing in their shared language and told Ayana to remember them all when she reached safety. Running Wolf took his position outside the cage, the rope in his hands. Ayana gripped the bars and prepared to push with all her strength. In the distance, she could hear one of the guards walking his patrol route. They had counted his steps many times and knew they had perhaps 10 minutes before he would return to this part of the settlement. The moment had come to risk everything for freedom. The lock snapped with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the silent trading post. Ayana froze, certain that every guard within miles must have heard the sound. But the night remained quiet except for the distant sound of the river and the soft breathing of sleeping captives. Running Wolf eased the cage door open just wide enough for her to slip through. Her legs, weak from weeks of confinement, almost buckled as she stood upright for the first time in so long. He caught her arm and steadied her, his warm touch reminding her that freedom was more than just a desperate dream. They moved like shadows between the buildings, keeping to the darkest areas where the moonlight could not reach them. Ayana's bare feet made no sound on the packed dirt, and Running Wolf seemed to glide rather than walk. Every few steps they paused to listen for any sign that their escape had been discovered. The guard's routine called for him to check the area near the cages in just a few minutes. They had to reach the river before then, or their chance would be lost forever. Running Wolf led her along a path he had obviously planned many times, avoiding the open areas where they might be seen. As they reached the edge of the settlement, a dog began to bark somewhere behind them. Ayana's heart stopped, but Running Wolf squeezed her hand and kept moving. The barking continued for a moment, then stopped. Perhaps the animal had been disturbed by a raccoon or some other night creature rather than by escaping humans. The river was closer than Ayana had realized during her weeks in the cage. The sound of moving water had been a constant background noise that she had learned to ignore, but now it represented the path to freedom. Running Wolf led her through tall grass and cattails that grew along the bank until they reached a small inlet where the water moved more slowly. His boat was exactly where he had promised it would be, hidden beneath a tangle of fallen branches and river plants. It was smaller than she had expected, barely large enough for 2 people, but it appeared sturdy and well-maintained. Running Wolf quickly cleared away the camouflage while Ayana kept watch for pursuing guards. Getting into the boat without making noise required careful coordination. The small vessel rocked dangerously as Ayana stepped in, and water sloshed against the sides. Running Wolf steadied it with his strong hands while she settled into the narrow space at the front. Then he pushed them away from the bank and climbed in behind her. The current caught them immediately, pulling the boat downstream faster than Ayana had expected. Running Wolf used a paddle to steer them toward the center of the river, where the water moved fastest. Behind them, the trading post grew smaller and smaller until it was just a few distant lights in the darkness. They traveled in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds being the gentle splash of the paddle and the whisper of water against the boat's sides. Ayana's body began to relax for the first time in weeks, but her mind remained alert. She knew that their escape would be discovered at dawn, and then the real chase would begin. Running Wolf seemed to read her thoughts. He spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the river sounds. He explained that they would travel by water until midday, when they would hide the boat and continue on foot. The river would carry them many miles from the trading post, but eventually they would need to cross overland to reach Dakota territory. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Running Wolf guided the boat toward the western bank. They had traveled much farther than Ayana had dared to hope, and the landscape around them looked completely different from the area near the trading post. This gave her hope that their pursuers might have difficulty tracking them. They pulled the boat into a small creek that branched off from the main river. Running Wolf had clearly scouted this location before, as he knew exactly where to hide the vessel among the overhanging willow branches. Within minutes, no trace of their passage remained visible from the river. The sound of barking dogs in the distance told them that their escape had been discovered. The noise was still far away, but it was growing louder as the search party moved downstream along the riverbank. Morrison's men were following exactly the route that Running Wolf had expected they would take. He led Ayana up the creek, walking in the shallow water to avoid leaving tracks that the dogs could follow. The cold water numbed her feet, but she welcomed the discomfort as a sign that she was truly free and moving under her own power. Every step took her further from the cage and closer to home. After walking upstream for nearly an hour, Running Wolf finally led her out of the water and onto solid ground. They were in a small valley surrounded by low hills covered with oak and maple trees. The autumn colors were brilliant in the morning sunlight, and Ayana realized how much she had missed the simple beauty of the natural world during her captivity. Running Wolf produced a bundle of supplies that he had hidden near the creek several days earlier. Inside were moccasins for Ayana's feet, dried meat and berries for food, warm blankets for the cold nights ahead, and most importantly, weapons for their protection. He handed her a sharp knife and showed her how to carry it concealed but ready for use. The sound of dogs grew louder, then began to fade as the search party continued downstream. Running Wolf smiled grimly and explained that he had chosen this spot because the creek split in 3 directions just below where they had left the river. The dogs would lose their scent trail and waste time trying to follow false leads, but he warned her that Morrison would not give up easily. The fat trader had lost valuable property, and he would send search parties in all directions. They would have perhaps a day's head start before the most persistent hunters figured out their true route and began to close the distance. They climbed out of the valley and began traveling northwest through the forested hills. Running Wolf set a pace that was fast but sustainable, and he chose paths that would be difficult for horses to follow. Sometimes they walked along rocky ridges where their feet would leave no marks. Other times they followed animal trails through thick underbrush that would slow down mounted pursuers. During a brief rest at midday, Ayanna asked Running Wolf why he had risked so much to help her. His answer was simple and direct. He told her that he had a younger sister who was about her age, and he could not bear to think of any young woman suffering as the captives in Morrison's cages suffered. Every person deserved to be free, to make their own choices about how to live their life. But there was something else in his eyes when he spoke, something deeper than general compassion for the oppressed. Ayanna realized that during the weeks of planning their escape, feelings had grown between them that went beyond the bond between rescuer and rescued. In the midst of terrible circumstances, they had found something precious and rare. The afternoon brought new challenges. They had to cross several open meadows where they could be seen from a great distance. Each time, Running Wolf scouted ahead to make sure no riders were visible before they made their dangerous sprint to the safety of the next patch of forest. The autumn sun felt good on Ayanna's face, but she knew it also made them visible to anyone who might be searching for them. As evening approached, they found shelter in a small cave hidden among a tumble of large rocks. Running Wolf had discovered this place during his earlier scouting trips, and he had left supplies here as well. They built a tiny fire deep in the cave where the smoke would not be visible from outside. For the first time since her capture, Ayanna ate a full meal of fresh meat and wild vegetables. The food tasted better than anything she could remember, perhaps because it was seasoned with the salt of freedom. Running Wolf watched her eat with satisfaction, like a brother caring for a sister who had been ill for a long time. That night, wrapped in warm blankets and listening to the peaceful sounds of the forest, Ayanna allowed herself to believe that they might actually reach safety, but she also knew that the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. The thunder of horses' hooves woke them before dawn. Running Wolf's eyes snapped open at the first sound, and he placed his hand gently over Ayanna's mouth to keep her from crying out in surprise. Through the cave entrance, they could see torches moving along the ridge above them. Morrison's search party had found their trail despite all their careful precautions. They gathered their supplies in complete silence, moving like ghosts in the dim cave. Running Wolf scattered the cold ashes of their fire and erased any sign that they had sheltered here. Every second counted now, as the searchers would soon realize that their quarry had spent the night in this area. The sound of voices carried clearly in the crisp morning air. Ayanna recognized Morrison's harsh tone giving orders to his men. He was telling them to spread out and search every cave, every hollow, every place where fugitives might hide. The fat trader's anger was obvious even at a distance, and she knew that their punishment would be severe if they were recaptured. Running Wolf led her deeper into the cave system than she had realized existed. What had seemed like a simple shelter was actually part of a network of connected caverns that stretched far into the hillside. He had obviously explored these passages before and knew exactly where they led. They crawled through narrow spaces and climbed over underground rock formations, always moving away from the entrance where the search party would eventually arrive. The darkness was complete except for the tiny flame of Running Wolf's torch, which he used sparingly to conserve their limited supply of burning materials. After what felt like hours of underground travel, they emerged from a hidden opening on the far side of the hill. The morning sun was fully up now, and they could see Morrison's men still searching the area around the main cave entrance far below them. The searchers had no idea that their quarry had already escaped through the back door of the mountain, but their relief was short-lived. As they moved across the next valley, Ayanna spotted more riders approaching from the north. Morrison had sent multiple search parties in different directions, and they were starting to close in from several sides at once. The net was tightening around them with each passing hour. Running Wolf studied the terrain carefully before choosing their route. He led them along a fast-moving stream that would mask their scent from the tracking dogs, even though the cold water slowed their progress. Sometimes they had to wade through pools that came up to their waists, and Ayanna's teeth chattered from the chill. The sound of dogs barking echoed from multiple directions now. The search parties were communicating with each other, coordinating their efforts to prevent the fugitives from slipping through their grasp. Morrison was proving to be a more determined pursuer than Running Wolf had anticipated. They climbed out of the stream valley and into rough country where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth was tangled with thorny vines. Their progress slowed as they had to push through barriers of vegetation that seemed designed to stop travelers. But the difficult terrain would also make it hard for mounted searchers to follow their path. Midday brought a moment of terror when they nearly walked into an ambush. Running Wolf's sharp eyes spotted the glint of metal among the trees just in time to pull Ayanna back into cover. A group of Morrison's men had positioned themselves along what they thought was the most likely escape route, waiting patiently for their prey to walk into the trap. They had to backtrack nearly a mile and find another way around the waiting hunters. The detour cost them precious time and energy, but it also revealed important information. Morrison's men were thinking like soldiers now, using strategy rather than just following tracks. The chase was becoming more dangerous by the hour. As they climbed toward a high ridge that offered a view of the surrounding country, Ayanna began to recognize landmarks from her childhood. They were getting close to the territory where her people sometimes hunted, though still far from her home village. The familiar sights gave her strength even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her body. From the ridgetop, they could see their pursuers spread across the landscape below. At least 3 separate groups of riders were converging on their general area, and the dogs were clearly following a scent trail that led in their direction. Morrison himself was with the largest group, his bulk visible even at a distance as he urged his men forward. Running Wolf pointed toward the northwest, where the land rose into higher hills covered with dense forest. He explained that Dakota territory began just beyond those hills, but reaching it would require crossing several miles of open ground where they would be completely exposed to anyone watching from the surrounding ridges. They rested briefly while Running Wolf studied their options. The direct route to safety was too dangerous with so many searchers in the area, but going around would take much longer, and their food supplies were already running low. Every choice involved terrible risks. A new sound made them both freeze in place. Somewhere not far below them, a man was calling out in Ayanna's native language. The voice was offering safe passage and good treatment if the fugitives would surrender peacefully. It was obviously a trap, but hearing her own tongue spoken in this hostile environment was deeply unsettling. Running Wolf whispered that Morrison had probably forced one of the other captives to make the announcement, hoping to lure them out of hiding. The fat trader was clever enough to know that desperate people might be fooled by familiar words, even when spoken by an enemy. They began their descent from the ridge, moving even more carefully now that they knew searchers were close enough to hear voices. Every step had to be planned, every movement controlled to avoid making noise that might give away their position. The afternoon sun beat down on them mercilessly as they worked their way through the broken landscape. A gunshot echoed across the hills, followed by excited shouting. One of the search parties had found something, though it was impossible to tell whether they had discovered actual fugitives or just another false trail. The sound sent chills through Ayanna's body, reminding her of what would happen if they were caught. As evening approached, they found themselves trapped in a narrow canyon with high walls on both sides. The only way forward led toward open country where they would be visible for miles. The only way back led toward the searchers who were steadily closing the distance behind them. Running Wolf's face was grim as he realized their situation, but Ayanna remembered something from her childhood, a story her grandfather had told about warriors who escaped from enemies by doing the unexpected. Instead of going forward or backward, they would climb straight up the canyon walls where no one thought to look for them. The rock face looked impossible to climb, but Running Wolf examined it carefully and found handholds that had been carved by wind and water over countless years. The climb would be dangerous, especially in the failing light, but it might be their only chance to escape the tightening trap. They began the ascent as darkness fell, feeling their way up the rough stone by touch more than sight. Ayanna's hands were soon scraped and bleeding from gripping the sharp rocks, but she forced herself to keep climbing. Below them, she could hear voices and see torches as Morrison's men searched the canyon floor. Halfway up the cliff face, disaster nearly struck when a loose rock broke free under Running Wolf's weight. The stone clattered down into the canyon with a noise that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. They pressed themselves against the wall and held their breath, waiting to see if the searchers had heard the sound. A torch appeared at the entrance to the canyon below them. One of Morrison's men called out, asking if anyone had heard something fall. Another voice answered that it was probably just an animal disturbing the rocks. After several tense minutes, the torch disappeared and the voices faded as the search party moved on to check other areas. They completed the climb in complete darkness, pulling themselves over the canyon rim just as the moon rose above the eastern hills. Their hands were raw and their bodies exhausted, but they had escaped the trap that had seemed certain to capture them. The open country stretched before them, silver in the moonlight and empty of pursuit. Running Wolf led them across the exposed ground at a steady trot, no longer trying to hide their passage but simply racing to reach the safety of Dakota territory. Before dawn brought fresh searchers. Their feet pounded against the hard earth in rhythm, and Ayanna felt strength flowing back into her body as the scent of freedom grew stronger. Behind them, the lights of Morrison's search parties continued to move through the hills they had left behind. The fat trader was still looking for them in the canyon and the surrounding valleys, not yet realizing that his prey had literally risen above his reach and escaped into the night. As they ran through the darkness toward the promise of safety, Ayanna allowed herself to believe for the first time that they might actually survive their desperate flight. The hills of Dakota territory were visible on the horizon, dark shapes against the star-filled sky that represented not just refuge, but the beginning of a new life, far from the chains and cages of Morrison's trading post. The Dakota village appeared in the morning mist like something from a dream. Ayanna had run through the night on legs that no longer seemed to belong to her body, following Running Wolf across streams and through forests until she thought she might collapse from exhaustion. But when she saw the familiar shapes of teepees arranged in the traditional circle, strength flowed back into her weary muscles. Children playing near the edge of the village were the first to spot them. They called out in excitement, running toward the approaching strangers with the fearless curiosity of the young. But their calls also brought warriors running, men with painted faces and weapons ready, prepared to defend their people from any threat. Running Wolf raised his arms high and called out his name in the Dakota language. The lead warrior, a man with gray streaking his long hair, lowered his spear and broke into a wide smile. This was Running Wolf's uncle, Standing Thunder, and his relief at seeing his nephew alive was obvious even from a distance. The reunion was brief but emotional. Standing Thunder embraced Running Wolf warmly, then listened with growing anger as his nephew explained what they had seen at Morrison's trading post. The old warrior's eyes burned with fury when he heard about the cages full of captive women and children, about the raiders who attacked peaceful villages to steal human lives. But Standing Thunder's expression softened when Running Wolf introduced Ayanna. The old man had daughters of his own, and he could see the suffering she had endured written clearly on her face and in her posture. He spoke to her gently in words mixed from several tribal languages, assuring her that she was safe now and would be protected as long as she remained with his people. The village's medicine woman, an ancient lady called Grandmother Willow, examined Ayanna's injuries and declared that her body would heal completely with rest and proper food. But she warned that the wounds to her spirit would take much longer to mend. The old woman prepared healing teas and salves while speaking in low, soothing tones about the strength of survivors. Over the following days, Ayanna slowly began to believe that her nightmare was truly over. The Dakota people welcomed her as family, sharing their food and their homes without asking for anything in return. Children brought her flowers and small gifts, while the women included her in their daily tasks as if she had always been part of their community. But even in safety, she could not forget the other captives they had left behind. Singing Bird's face haunted her dreams, along with the faces of all the other women and men still trapped in Morrison's cages. She spoke with Running Wolf about her guilt at being the only one to escape, and he understood her feelings completely. He told her that their escape had not been in vain, even though they could not save everyone immediately. The information he had gathered about Morrison's operation would help the Dakota and other tribes coordinate their resistance against the slave raiders. Already messengers were carrying warnings to villages throughout the region. Standing Thunder called a council meeting to discuss what should be done about the trading post. The tribal elders debated long into the night, weighing the risks of direct action against the moral duty to rescue the captives. Some argued for an immediate attack, while others counseled patience and careful planning. Running Wolf stood before the council and spoke with passionate conviction about what he had witnessed. He described the suffering of the captives in detail, the cruelty of Morrison and his men, and the growing threat that the slave trade represented to all free people. His words moved even the most cautious elders to anger. But it was Ayanna who provided the crucial information that turned the council toward action. She had observed Morrison's routines carefully during her weeks in captivity, and she knew the weaknesses in the trading post's defenses. Her testimony gave the warriors the knowledge they needed to plan a successful rescue mission. The war party that rode out 3 days later was larger than any the Dakota had assembled in years. Warriors from allied tribes had joined the expedition, all united in their determination to strike a blow against the slave traders. Running Wolf rode beside his uncle, while Ayanna watched from the village with prayers on her lips. The attack came at dawn, just as Morrison's men were beginning their daily routines. The Dakota warriors struck from multiple directions at once, overwhelming the guards before they could organize effective resistance. The trading post's wooden buildings burned as the captives were freed from their cages and chains. Morrison himself tried to escape by boat, but Dakota warriors were waiting for him on the river. His capture marked the end of one of the most notorious slave trading operations in the entire region. Some of his men were killed in the fighting, while others were taken prisoner to face tribal justice for their crimes. The rescued captives included Singing Bird, who wept with joy when she learned that Ayanna's escape had led to their freedom. Many of the freed people chose to remain with the Dakota, rather than attempt the dangerous journey back to their distant home villages. The tribe welcomed them all, understanding that survival sometimes required building new families from the fragments of broken ones. In the weeks that followed, Ayanna faced a difficult choice. Running Wolf offered to help her return to her own people, to the village where her grandmother and little brother waited for news of her survival. But he also made it clear that she would be welcome to stay among the Dakota permanently, to make a new life with people who had risked everything to ensure her freedom. The decision became easier when messengers arrived with news from her home village. The raiders who had captured her had returned weeks later to attack the settlement again. This time her people had been prepared and had driven off the attackers, but the fighting had been fierce. Her grandmother had been killed defending the children, and her little brother had been adopted by another family. The pain of losing her grandmother was almost unbearable, but Ayanna found comfort in knowing that the old woman had died as she had lived, protecting those she loved. The messenger also brought word that her mother, who had been sold to different traders, had been freed during another rescue mission and was safely living with relatives in a distant village. With the threads that connected her to her old life severed or changed forever, Ayanna made her choice. She would stay with the Dakota people who had become her new family. She would make a life with Running Wolf, whose courage had saved not just her but dozens of other captives as well. Their wedding took place when the autumn leaves were at their most brilliant, a celebration that brought together survivors and rescuers in a ceremony that honored both love and freedom. Ayanna wore traditional Dakota bridal dress decorated with beads and quill work made by the village women, while Running Wolf stood proud in the regalia of a proven warrior. Years later, when their own children asked about the scars on their mother's wrists where the chains had once bound her, Ayanna would tell them the story of how sometimes the darkest times in life can lead to the greatest blessings. She would speak of the strength that comes from surviving terrible ordeals, and of the courage required to help others find their own freedom. The trading post never reopened. Morrison's death during the Dakota raid sent a clear message to other slave traders that their victims were not alone and helpless. The networks of communication between tribes, strengthened by the shared fight against the raiders, continued to protect villages throughout the region for generations to come. And in the Dakota village where Ayanna had found sanctuary and love, her story was remembered and retold as proof that no chains are strong enough to hold a determined spirit, and that sometimes a single act of courage can change the fate of many.